From arguably the most famous, volatile, and culturally impactful maximum security prison in Pennsylvania history, to a prison that houses a highly secretive and heavily restrictive solitary confinement block. Today, we dive inside the top 10 most dangerous prisons in Pennsylvania and take a look at their dangerous residents. Case 1. Miranda Barber Facility, State Correctional Institution, Muncie, November 11, 2013. Northumberland County Court of Common Pleas picture Sunbury, Pennsylvania, on a cold November night in 2013. It's the kind of small, central Pennsylvania city where the streets empty out early, where porch lights and the hum of a nearby highway are the only company after dark. Nothing about this town suggested it would become the backdrop for one of the strangest and most disturbing killings in the state's modern history. 3 weeks before that night, an 18-year-old woman named Miranda Barber had married a man named Elit Barber in North Carolina. To the outside world, they looked like any other young newlywed couple, impulsive, in love, starting their lives together. But behind closed doors, something far darker was taking shape. According to their own later confessions, the two had begun talking about killing someone. Not out of anger, not out of revenge. Simply, in their words, for the thrill of it, and they decided to treat it as a kind of twisted gift to mark Elit's birthday. Miranda placed an online ad offering companionship for money. It read like 100 other ads on that corner of the internet, vague, transactional, easy to overlook. But for a 42-year-old man named Troy LaFerrara of the small community of Port Trevorton, it was simply an opportunity. He had no way of knowing he was answering something engineered specifically to find a victim. They agreed to meet in a shopping mall parking lot in Hummel's Wharf. Imagine LaFerrara pulling in that evening, headlights sweeping across a half-empty lot, expecting an ordinary transaction. He gets into the vehicle. Everything seems unremarkable. What he doesn't know is that just a few feet away, hidden beneath a blanket in the back seat, Elit Barber is lying completely still, waiting. Miranda pulls out of the lot and drives roughly 6 miles towards Sunbury. The mood in the car, at least from LaFerrara's side, is almost certainly relaxed, unaware. Then, in a quiet alleyway away from streetlights and passers-by, Miranda says a phrase the couple had rehearsed in advance, an ordinary-sounding line about the stars. It was the signal. Elit rises from beneath the blanket and wraps a cord around LaFerrara's neck. LaFerrara fights, hard enough to break free and try to get out of the moving vehicle. In that chaos, Miranda uses a knife. By the time it's over, LaFerrara is gone. The couple takes his wallet, leaves his body behind in the alley, and, almost unbelievably, uses the stolen cash to go celebrate that same night. For a while, the case runs cold. There's no immediate suspect, no witness, no obvious motive. But investigators trace the last calls made from LaFerrara's phone, and the trail leads directly back to Miranda. When police begin questioning the couple, their explanation shifts. First towards self-defense, then, piece by piece, into a full and staggering confession of premeditation. What happened next turned a local homicide into a national media event. From jail, Miranda began giving interviews claiming she had once been part of a violent cult and had taken part in the deaths of more than 20 other people across multiple states. Reporters flew in. True crime forums exploded with theories. The FBI and local investigators spent real time and resources chasing down her claims. They found nothing. No missing persons matched. No bodies, no corroborating evidence anywhere. Law enforcement ultimately determined the claims were invented. Whether for attention, notoriety, or something else entirely is something only Miranda Barber has ever really known. With the death penalty on the table, both Miranda and Elit accepted plea agreements, pleading guilty to second-degree murder, along with aggravated assault and robbery charges. On September 18, 2014, a Northumberland County judge sentenced them both to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Miranda was sent to the State Correctional Institution at Muncie, where she remains incarcerated today. Behind every viral headline about satanic thrill killers was a real man, a husband, someone's neighbor, whose family had to bury him while the world turned his death into entertainment. Troy LaFerrara didn't choose to become a headline. He simply answered an ad. If this story affected you, take a moment right now to like this video and subscribe to Cold Case Hour. It genuinely helps this channel keep telling these cases with the depth they deserve. Drop a comment below with your thoughts. We read every one. Before we move into Case 2. Case 2. Amber Meidinger Facility, State Correctional Institution, Cambridge Springs, February 11, 2010, Westmoreland County Court of Common Pleas. Some crimes are sudden, an explosion of violence in a single terrible moment. Others unfold slowly, hour by hour, in a way that makes them almost harder to comprehend. The case of Jennifer Doherty is the second kind. Jennifer was 30 years old, living with an intellectual disability that by most accounts gave her a childlike trust in the people around her. In Greensburg, Pennsylvania, she knew a young woman named Amber Meidinger from a local community center that served people with special needs. It was an ordinary, unremarkable friendship, the kind built on familiarity rather than depth. And it was exactly that trust that made Jennifer feel safe enough to travel to an apartment on Pennsylvania Avenue in Greensburg on February 8, 2010, believing she was visiting friends. She had no way of knowing what was waiting for her. Inside that apartment were 6 people, including Amber Meidinger, then 20 years old and pregnant, along with her boyfriend and several others who had drifted together through shelters, shared housing, and mutual acquaintances. Over the following 3 days, that ordinary apartment became the site of sustained cruelty. Jennifer was restrained. She was denied food, dignity, and any real chance to leave. Investigators later learned the group forced her to write a note designed to look like a farewell letter, as though preparing to stage her death as something she chose herself. At one point, after Jennifer survived what the group intended to be a fatal act, several of them made a decision that still feels almost impossible to say out loud. They voted to make sure she didn't survive a second time. Amber Meidinger did not deliver the final fatal act herself. That responsibility belonged to 2 co-defendants who would later be sentenced to death for their roles. But Meidinger was present through the entire 3-day ordeal, and she took an active part in the abuse that preceded Jennifer's death. On February 11, 2010, Jennifer's body was discovered near a local school. Investigators moved fast. Within a day, working from information about who Jennifer had last planned to visit, police identified and arrested all 6 people connected to the apartment. What followed were years of trials, appeals, and testimony. Amber Meidinger made a choice that would define the rest of her case. She agreed to cooperate with Westmoreland County prosecutors and testified against her co-defendants in open court. In December of 2013, she pleaded guilty to 3rd-degree murder, kidnapping, and conspiracy. Standing before the sentencing judge, she said, in her own words, that she hated herself for what had happened to Jennifer. The court sentenced her to a term of 40 to 80 years. She has served her sentence at the State Correctional Institution at Cambridge Springs, one of only 2 state prisons in Pennsylvania that house female offenders. In the years since, Jennifer Doherty's family has worked to make sure she isn't remembered only as a victim. Her sister has spoken publicly, more than once, about who Jennifer really was: a daughter, a sister, a woman who trusted easily in a world that didn't deserve that trust. We've noticed that most of you watching haven't subscribed to Cold Case Hour yet. Before we move to the next case, take 2 seconds to make sure you're subscribed so you never miss one of these stories. If this one moved you, hit like and leave a comment below. It helps this channel keep going. Case 3. Tabitha Buck Facility, State Correctional Institution, Muncie, released on parole. December 2019, December 20th, 1991. Case tried in Lehigh County. Venue moved from Lancaster County. Some crimes don't begin with the crime itself. They begin months earlier in the slow, quiet build-up of jealousy that nobody around it takes seriously enough, until it's too late. In East Lampeter Township, just outside Lancaster, 16-year-old Lori Show was a sophomore at Conestoga Valley High School. She was, by every account, left behind by the people who loved her, an ordinary teenage girl. Good grades, a part-time job, a mother named Hazel who worked hard to give her a stable home. Lori's only real entanglement with trouble came from a boy she'd briefly dated named Lawrence Youngkin. The problem was, Youngkin had a girlfriend, an on-and-off relationship with a young woman named Lisa Michelle Lambert. When Lambert learned that Youngkin and Lori had spent time together, something in her fixated. For months, Lori was harassed, followed, and threatened by Lambert, who saw her not as a passing acquaintance but as a rival to be eliminated. Lambert didn't act alone. She recruited a 17-year-old friend, Tabitha Buck, to help her carry out what she was planning. On the morning of December 20th, 1991, with Lori's mother already gone to work, Buck and Lambert arrived at the family's townhouse. Buck knocked on the door and, trusting a familiar face, Lori let them in. It was a decision that cost her everything. Once inside, the two overpowered her. Buck held Lori down, pinning her legs so she couldn't fight or run, while Lambert used a kitchen knife to attack her. Lori was left severely wounded, bleeding out inside her own home. When her mother returned just minutes later, Lori was still alive, barely. She managed to say the names of who had done this to her before she died in her mother's arms. The case against Lambert, Buck and Youngkin, who had driven the two to the house and later helped dispose of evidence, became one of the most closely watched trials in Pennsylvania history. It was covered by national news programs, turned into a made-for-television movie, and the subject of at least one book. Because of the intense local media coverage, Buck's trial was ultimately moved out of Lancaster County entirely, relocated to a courtroom in Lehigh County to help ensure a fair jury. Buck was convicted of second-degree murder and sentenced to life in prison without parole. Lambert, who was 18 at the time of the killing, legally an adult, received the same sentence and continues to this day to maintain her innocence from a prison outside Pennsylvania. Youngkin, who cooperated with investigators, was convicted of third-degree murder and served 12 years before being paroled. For more than 2 decades, that appeared to be the end of it. But in 2012, the United States Supreme Court ruled that mandatory life without parole sentences for juvenile offenders were unconstitutional. Since Buck had been a minor at the time of the crime, her case qualified for review. In 2017, a Lancaster County judge resentenced her to 28 years to life. Having already served 26 years, Buck became eligible for parole almost immediately. In December of 2019, she walked out of the state correctional institution at Muncie a free woman, barred, under the terms of her release, from ever returning to Lancaster County or contacting Laurie Show's family again. Laurie Show never got to graduate high school, never got to grow older than 16. Her mother, Hazel, spent the following decades speaking at every hearing, every appeal, refusing to let her daughter's name fade into a court file. If you're finding value in these stories, take a second to like this video and subscribe to Cold Case Hour. It costs nothing, and it helps us keep bringing you cases like this one, carefully researched, respectfully told. Let us know in the comments what stood out to you most before we continue to Case 4. Case 4, Heather Presti Facility, State Correctional Institution, Muncie Crimes committed 2020 through 2023, guilty plea and sentencing May 2, 2024, Butler County Court of Common Pleas. Of every case in this series, this next one may be the hardest to sit with, not because of a single violent night, but because of how long it went unnoticed and how completely it violated the one relationship we're taught to trust without question, the relationship between a patient and the person caring for them. Heather Presti was a registered nurse working across several skilled nursing and rehabilitation facilities in Allegheny, Armstrong, Butler, and Westmoreland counties, the kind of quiet, unglamorous healthcare work that keeps elderly and disabled patients alive day to day. Beginning in 2020, according to investigators, Presti began using that access for something unthinkable. She started administering excessive, calculated doses of insulin to patients under her care, including patients who were not even diabetic and had no medical reason to receive the drug at all. Insulin, when given in the wrong amounts, causes a patient's blood sugar to crash catastrophically, triggering seizures, comas, and, without fast intervention, death. Investigators later said Presti appeared to time her actions carefully, often administering the doses in a way meant to ensure a patient would decline before a shift change, when new staff might catch what was happening, or send them to a hospital where blood testing could expose her. Over roughly 3 years, prosecutors say Presti targeted 22 patients this way. 17 of them did not survive. Investigators later said Presti had described some of these patients to co-workers as difficult to care for, or as people she believed had little quality of life left, a chilling rationale that, in her own words to police, she framed as a form of mercy. It was a report about one patient's suspicious decline in late 2022 that finally opened the door. The Pennsylvania Attorney General's office launched a full investigation, and what they found went far beyond a single incident. It uncovered what investigators would later describe as a sustained years-long pattern hidden across 5 different care facilities. Text messages later recovered from Presti's phone, sent to a family member, included disturbing remarks about wanting to harm people, statements prosecutors used to establish intent, not impulse. Presti was arrested in May of 2023. Facing the possibility of the death penalty, she ultimately agreed to a plea deal. On May 2, 2024, in a packed Butler County courtroom, she pleaded guilty to 3 counts of first-degree murder and 19 counts of criminal attempt to commit murder. Nearly 40 family members of her victims were present to speak. A judge sentenced her to 3 consecutive life terms without parole, plus an additional consecutive sentence of 380 to 760 years. One victim's sister told reporters outside the courthouse that no sentence would ever feel like real justice, that the only justice left was something beyond this world. Another family member said plainly that a life sentence doesn't return the years, the holidays, or the goodbyes that were stolen from families who trusted a healthcare system to protect the people they loved most. Heather Presty is currently incarcerated at the State Correctional Institution at Muncie. If this case is a reminder of anything, it's that vigilance in caregiving settings matters. Families are encouraged to ask questions, request records, and trust their instincts if something about a loved one's care feels wrong. If you found this case as unsettling as we did, take a moment to like, comment, and subscribe to Cold Case Hour so you don't miss what's next. Case 5. Sarah Packer Offender. Sarah Packer Facility, SCI Muncie Location, Richland Township, Bucks County, Pennsylvania. Year 2016. Victim Grace Packer, 14 years old. Crime details. Sarah Packer's career should have made her Grace's greatest advocate. As a former Children and Youth Services caseworker, she had spent years assessing homes for safety, evaluating whether children were being properly cared for. Instead, investigators say she was responsible for one of the most disturbing betrayals of trust in Pennsylvania's history, against her own adoptive daughter. Sarah conspired with her boyfriend, Jacob Sullivan, to carry out a plan that investigators say had been discussed between the couple in advance, one that targeted 14-year-old Grace. In July of 2016, Sarah brought Grace to a rented home. Once there, Grace was restrained and heavily sedated, and Sullivan subjected her to a severe assault while Sarah reportedly did nothing to stop it. Afterward, the couple left Grace, still heavily sedated, alone in a room under conditions that were not survivable. When they returned hours later and found she was still alive, Sullivan ended her life. In the aftermath, rather than reporting what had happened, the couple concealed Grace's remains inside their own home for months before ultimately disposing of them in a remote wooded area of Luzerne County. Throughout this period, Sarah maintained the fiction that Grace was simply a runaway, filing a report with police to that effect, all while continuing to fraudulently collect and cash her missing daughter's government assistance checks. The truth only came to light months later when Sullivan, during a medical emergency, confessed the full story to hospital staff. Outcome: Sarah Packer pleaded guilty to first-degree murder and criminal conspiracy. She was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole, along with an additional consecutive sentence of 52 to 104 years. Her case remains one of the most painful examples of institutional trust betrayed, a reminder of why rigorous oversight of foster and adoptive placements remains critical. If you have concerns about a child's safety in a foster or adoptive home, the Child Help National Child Abuse Hotline is available around the clock to take reports. We've noticed that most of you watching haven't subscribed to Cold Case Hour yet. Before we move on to the next case, take just 2 seconds to make sure you're subscribed so you never miss another gripping true crime documentary. If you're enjoying the stories we bring you, don't forget to like this video and leave a comment. We'd love to hear your thoughts. Case 6. Patricia Rora Facility, SCI Muncie Location, Catasauqua, Lehigh County, Pennsylvania. Year 1994. Victim Joanne Katrinak, 26 years old, and her infant son, Alex Katrinak, 3 months old. Crime details. In the small borough of Catasauqua, nestled along the Lehigh River, Joanne Katrinak was building a quiet life with her husband and their newborn son. What she didn't know was that hundreds of miles away, in North Carolina, a woman named Patricia Rora had never let go of a relationship with Joanne's husband that ended years earlier. As Rora learned more about her ex's new marriage and growing family, investigators say her jealousy hardened into obsession. She made the long drive north, crossing state lines with a target already fixed in her mind. When she arrived at the Katrinak home, she moved with chilling deliberateness, first cutting the telephone lines to eliminate any chance of a call for help, then forcing her way inside. What followed was a home invasion that turned into an abduction. Rora took both Joanne and her 3-month-old son Alex, forcing them into a vehicle and driving them to an isolated muddy trail far from town. There, she attacked Joanne with overwhelming, sustained force before shooting her. Then, in an act that still disturbs the investigators who worked the case decades later, she left baby Alex exposed to the freezing winter air beside his mother's body. With no one to care for him, the infant could not survive the cold and hunger. He died alongside his mother. It would be 4 months before a hunter walking through the remote woods discovered their remains. By then, leads had gone cold and the case seemed at risk of remaining unsolved. But investigators pursued a forensic technique rarely used in American courtrooms at the time: mitochondrial DNA analysis on strands of hair recovered from the family's vehicle. The results tied Rohrer directly to the crime scene, and the case became one of the first in United States legal history to secure a conviction using this method, a breakthrough that would go on to influence cold case investigations nationwide. Outcome: a jury convicted Patricia Rohrer of 2 counts of first-degree murder and 2 counts of kidnapping. She was sentenced to 2 consecutive life terms without the possibility of parole. Decades later, Rohrer continues to maintain her innocence, but the forensic evidence and the jury's verdict told a different story. We've noticed that most of you watching haven't subscribed to Cold Case Hour yet. Before we move on to the next case, take just 2 seconds to make sure you're subscribed so you never miss another gripping true crime documentary. If you're enjoying the stories we bring you, don't forget to like this video and leave a comment. We'd love to hear your thoughts. Case 7. Jamie Silverneck Facility, SCI Muncie Location, South Whitehall Township, Lehigh County, Pennsylvania. Year: 2015. Victim: Cheryl Silverneck, 54 years old. Crime details. On the surface, Cheryl Silverneck was doing what countless parents do every day: setting boundaries for her 14-year-old daughter. She disapproved of Jamie's relationship with Caleb Barnes, a 20-year-old active-duty U.S. Army soldier, and she made her disapproval clear. It was an ordinary act of parenting. It would cost Cheryl her life. In the days that followed, a disturbing pattern began to emerge in text messages that investigators would later recover. Jamie, still only 14, escalated her communication with Barnes, framing her mother as the sole obstacle keeping them apart. She pressed him relentlessly and at one point sent a message that would become central to the prosecution's case: "She needs to go." It wasn't a passing outburst of teenage frustration. Investigators say it was part of a deliberate, ongoing campaign to convince Barnes to act. The plan came together on what should have been an unremarkable family evening. The Silvernecks went out to dinner together, an outing that looked from the outside like nothing more than a routine night out. But when the car pulled back into the driveway of their South Whitehall Township home, Caleb Barnes was already there waiting. What happened next unfolded in the front seat of the family car, with Jamie sitting only feet away. Barnes stabbed Cheryl Silverneck to death as her daughter looked on. Rather than seeking help or calling for aid, Jamie and Barnes worked together in the aftermath, cleaning the heavy blood spill from the vehicle and driving to a remote wooded area, where they buried Cheryl in a shallow grave. The case shook Lehigh County, not only for its brutality, but for the age of the person who had orchestrated it. Prosecutors, armed with a clear digital trail of premeditation, made the decision to try Jamie Silverneck as an adult, despite her being just 14 years old at the time of the killing, a decision that underscored how seriously the court viewed the evidence of planning and intent. Outcome: Jamie Silverneck ultimately pleaded guilty to first-degree murder, conspiracy, and abuse of a corpse. She was sentenced to 35 years to life in prison, a term that will keep her incarcerated well into adulthood. The case remains one of the starkest reminders of how quickly family conflict can spiral into tragedy, and how digital communication can either protect a life or help destroy one. We've noticed that most of you watching haven't subscribed to Cold Case Hour yet. Before we move on to the next case, take just 2 seconds to make sure you're subscribed so you never miss another gripping true crime documentary. If you're enjoying the stories we bring you, don't forget to like this video and leave a comment. We'd love to hear your thoughts. Case 8. Shonda Walter Facility, SCI Muncie Location, Lock Haven, Clinton County, Pennsylvania. Year: 2003. Victim: James Cementelli, 70 years old. Crime details: James Cementelli was a quiet World War II veteran living out his later years in Lock Haven, a small town along the West Branch Susquehanna River. He was known to neighbors as unassuming and private, the kind of man who kept to himself and asked for nothing from anyone. That quiet life made him, in the eyes of his 23-year-old neighbor, Shonda Walter, an easy and convenient target. Investigators say Walter's motive had nothing to do with any grievance against Cementelli personally. Instead, prosecutors argued she was driven by greed and by a desire to prove her toughness to a local street gang she wanted acceptance from. To Walter, an elderly man living alone represented opportunity, a chance to take something without much resistance, and a chance to build a reputation. She entered his home carrying a heavy hatchet. What followed was a frenzied, prolonged attack. Walter striking Cementelli more than 60 times, fracturing his skull and face beyond recognition. Investigators who processed the scene would later describe it as one of the most disturbing crime scenes in the county's history, a level of violence that seemed to go far beyond anything necessary to overpower an elderly victim. After the attack, Walter ransacked the home, stealing his television set, a container of loose quarters, and, most brazenly, his car. In the days that followed, rather than showing any remorse or attempting to hide her involvement, she reportedly bragged to friends about what she had done, treating the killing as a badge of status. Her undoing came when police, searching for Sementelli's missing vehicle, spotted Walter behind the wheel of the stolen car. The case drew significant attention throughout Pennsylvania, not only because of its brutality, but because of where it placed Walter in the state's legal history. She became the last woman sentenced to death in Pennsylvania before the state's executive moratorium on capital punishment took effect, freezing all executions indefinitely. Outcome: Shonda Walter was convicted of first-degree murder and initially sentenced to death. After more than a decade of appeals working through the courts, her death sentence was overturned, and she was resentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Her case remains a frequently cited example in discussions of Pennsylvania's death penalty moratorium and its impact on cases that predate it. We've noticed that most of you watching haven't subscribed to Cold Case Hour yet. Before we move on to the next case, take just 2 seconds to make sure you're subscribed so you never miss another gripping true crime documentary. If you're enjoying the stories we bring you, don't forget to like this video and leave a comment. We'd love to hear your thoughts. Case 9. Elena House Hay Facility, SCI Muncie Location, Perkiomen Township, Montgomery County, Pennsylvania. Year 2017. Victim, Annette House, 54 years old. Crime details. For most families, disagreements over medical treatment are stressful but survivable. A difficult conversation, a disagreement, and eventually, some kind of resolution. For Annette House and her 21-year-old daughter, Elena House Hay, one such conversation would end in tragedy. The dispute centered on Elena's treatment plan for bipolar disorder, specifically disagreements over her medication management. What began as a tense discussion between mother and daughter escalated rapidly. Investigators say that as the argument intensified, something in Elena snapped. She walked downstairs into the kitchen, pulled a large, wooden-handled kitchen knife from the counter block, and climbed the stairs to her mother's second-floor bedroom. There, she ambushed her mother, stabbing her multiple times in the chest and torso in an attack investigators would later describe as sudden and overwhelming. In the immediate aftermath, rather than seeking help honestly, Elena called emergency services and constructed an elaborate cover story, telling dispatchers that an unknown male intruder in a grey sweatshirt had broken into the home and attacked her mother. The story began to unravel almost as soon as officers arrived. Responding police immediately noticed that Elena herself was covered in blood and had fresh cuts across her hands, inconsistent with someone who claimed to have merely discovered the scene. As detectives dug deeper into her phone records, they found a text message sent to a friend just before the attack that read simply, "Haha, I hate my family." It was a chilling piece of digital evidence that all but dismantled her fabricated alibi. The case drew attention not only for its violence, but for the questions it raised about mental health, family caregiving, and the strain that can build inside households managing a loved one's psychiatric treatment. Prosecutors and the court ultimately took Elena's documented mental health history into account during sentencing. Outcome: Elena House Hay entered a plea of guilty but mentally ill to third-degree murder. She was sentenced to 20 to 40 years in prison, with the court mandating specialized psychiatric treatment throughout her incarceration. Her case remains a widely discussed example of how the justice system attempts to balance accountability with mental illness in violent crime cases. If you or someone you know is struggling with mental health challenges, the 988 Suicide and Crisis Lifeline is available for support. We've noticed that most of you watching haven't subscribed to Cold Case Hour yet. Before we move on to the next case, take just 2 seconds to make sure you're subscribed so you never miss another gripping true crime documentary. If you're enjoying the stories we bring you, don't forget to like this video and leave a comment. We'd love to hear your thoughts. Case 10. Michelle Tharp Facility, SCI Muncie Location, Burgettstown, Washington County, Pennsylvania. Year 1998. Victim, Tausha Lee Lanham, 7 years old. Crime details. Of all the cases that have passed through Washington County's court system, few have left investigators as shaken as the case of 7-year-old Tausha Lee Lanham. To the outside world, Michelle Tharp appeared to be an ordinary mother raising her children in Burgettstown, a small borough not far from the West Virginia border. But behind closed doors, One child in that household was living a nightmare that would go undetected for years. Investigators say Tharp fed and clothed her other children normally, showing them the basic care any parent would provide. Tauscher, however, was singled out for a level of cruelty that would later horrify even seasoned detectives. She was confined to a room in the home, with clothing and objects packed against the door to prevent her escape. She was forbidden from touching the refrigerator or accessing food along with the rest of the family. Left with no other option to survive, the 7-year-old resorted to eating toothpaste and pet food just to have something in her stomach. The abuse continued for a prolonged period, with no intervention from anyone outside the home. By the time Tauscher's body gave out under the weight of prolonged malnutrition and dehydration, she weighed just 11.7 pounds, roughly the average weight of a 3-month-old infant, not a child of 7 years old. It was a detail that would later stun the medical examiners who processed her case, several of whom said they had never encountered a case of starvation so severe in a living child. When Tauscher died, Tharp did not call for help or report what had happened. Instead, she and her boyfriend loaded the little girl's body into a car and drove across state lines into a remote area of West Virginia, discarding her remains in the bushes as though disposing of evidence rather than grieving a child. They then drove to a local shopping mall where they placed a call to police falsely reporting that Tauscher had been abducted by a stranger, an attempt to shift blame entirely away from the home where she had actually suffered. The fabricated story did not hold up long. When investigators located Tauscher's remains, medical examiners immediately identified signs of extreme prolonged starvation that were entirely inconsistent with a recent abduction. The physical evidence told a story the false report could never explain away, and the investigation quickly turned back toward the home Tauscher had never been allowed to safely leave. Outcome: Michelle Tharp was convicted of first-degree murder. She was originally sentenced to death, making her one of only a small number of women ever placed on Pennsylvania's modern death row. Years later, her death sentence was overturned after claims of intellectual disability were raised on appeal, and she was resentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Tauscher's case remains one of the most heartbreaking reminders of why child welfare checks and mandatory reporting laws exist, systems designed to catch what neighbors and relatives sometimes cannot see. If you suspect a child is being abused or neglected, the Child Help National Child Abuse Hotline is available 24 hours a day to take reports and connect families with support. We've noticed that most of you watching haven't subscribed to Cold Case Hour yet. Before we wrap up today's documentary, take just 2 seconds to make sure you're subscribed so you never miss another gripping true crime documentary. If you're enjoying the stories we bring you, don't forget to like this video and leave a comment. We'd love to hear your thoughts. 10 women, 10 counties across the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania, 10 cases that on the surface seem to share nothing in common. Different decades, different motives, different victims, different circumstances entirely. And yet, taken together, they paint a haunting portrait of how violence can emerge from the most ordinary corners of life. A Craigslist ad, a family dinner, a hospital night shift, a teenage romance, a mother's disapproval, a jealousy that never faded. What strikes investigators most, looking back across these cases, isn't just the brutality, though there is plenty of that. It's the proximity. Almost none of these women were strangers to their victims. Miranda Barber hunted online, yes, but Amber Meidinger tortured a woman who trusted her enough to visit for a doctor's appointment. Tabitha Buck helped kill a classmate over a teenage grudge. Sarah Packer destroyed the very child she was legally entrusted to protect. Jamie Silverneck and Elena House-Hay turned on their own mothers. Patricia Rora traveled hundreds of miles to attack a family that had never wronged her at all, only loved someone she couldn't let go of. And then there are the cases that remind us evil doesn't always look like rage. Heather Presti wore scrubs and carried a nursing badge. She walked hospital hallways where the sick and elderly should have been safest, and she turned quiet night shifts into killing fields, all while telling herself, and later investigators, that she believed she was showing mercy. Michelle Tharp lived under the same roof as her own daughter for years, hiding a level of cruelty so severe it defied belief, until a 7-year-old girl weighed less than a newborn baby. These stories are difficult to sit with. They should be. Every name we've spoken today: Troy LaFerrara, Jennifer Doherty, Laurie Show, the 17 patients failed by the very system meant to protect them, Grace Packer, Joanne and Alex Katrinak, Cheryl Silverneck, James Sementelli, Annette House, and Tauscher Lanham, represents a life that mattered, a family left behind, and a community forever changed. Pennsylvania's courts pursued justice in each of these cases, whether through life sentences, negotiated pleas, or in a few instances the state's now suspended death penalty. But no verdict undoes what was lost. If these stories tell us anything, it's the importance of paying attention to the quiet warning signs in relationships, to elderly neighbors living alone, to children who seem to disappear from view, to patients under someone else's care, to the people around us who might be suffering in silence. Awareness doesn't undo tragedy, but it can prevent the next one. That's 10 of the most devastating true crime cases to come out of the state of Pennsylvania. Cases we researched carefully so we could bring them to you with the respect these victims and their families deserve. If today's documentary moved you, informed you, or left you thinking, that's exactly what Cold Case Hour is here to do. Before you go, we've noticed that many of you watching still haven't subscribed to Cold Case Hour. If you want to keep following cases like these, hit that subscribe button right now so you never miss the next investigation. And if this documentary held your attention from start to finish, give it a like and drop a comment below. Let us know which case affected you the most. We read every single one. Thank you for watching. We'll see you in the next case.